Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the podcast, host Craig Jeffery catches up with Jon Paquette, Senior Financial Solutions Expert at TIS, to discuss the concept of stacking your defensive line against payment fraud. Topics of discussion cover the importance of payment security and protection layers, points of intrusion, mitigation strategies, and more. Listen in to find out how to protect your organization against payment fraud.
Jon, thanks so much for joining me on the Treasury Update podcast again. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Happy to be here again.
Hey, Jon, I know you've been on the podcast before, and I think we've talked briefly about some of your career highlights, but I just thought it would be good if you give us a quick overview of your career, your background, and what are you currently doing?
Yeah, sure. So I'm currently the head of customer success for TIS's U.S. market, which involves overseeing our customer onboarding team, our solutions architects team, and some of our partner engagement functions and onboarding as well. So joined TIS back in 2019, but I really spent the early part of my career as a Treasury practitioner directly, which I think was about maybe just shy of 15 years experience in the Treasury practitioner space. So, fighting the fight against fraud on the front line there, in my time it was weekly, if not daily, BEC and phishing attacks, which I guess are some of the attacks that are still out there today. But it's been interesting to make the transition over to the technology side and get to see both how fraud has, morphed over the years, adapted over the years, and also what technology providers are doing to help organizations combat it.
I know that experience informs this discussion as well as some of the other conversations that we've had. And for those listening, we have a webinar that we did on this topic, covering some different areas. So this is complementary and expansive on some of those areas. But Jon, as we look at payment security, there's a core question. What's the reason payment security is important? Maybe we should think about this in context. As a practitioner, you described what's going on. Things haven't gotten better as you move to serving companies and helping to protect their payment processes. But help us understand the reasoning behind this topic and this concept.
Yeah, I think today there are just so many different points of entry. We talk commonly about payment diversion, but that takes so many different forms these days, it seems like. There's the attacks on the payment initiators directly through business email compromise attempts. There's, gaining access to payment initiating systems through phishing and man-in-the-middle attacks. And now there's even points of entry that are further downstream from the actual payment initiation process that more target the AP and procurement departments. So these are the fake invoice attacks that we're seeing being really prevalent these days. Fake supplier wire instruction change requests are another one that a lot of organizations are having trouble keeping up with. And so it's important to be aware of all these threats, I think, who's targeted in each one of these situations and really how you can protect your organization at all these different points of entry.
You mentioned some of these attack methods that have been around for a while. We all would say the threat level is very high, and the majority of Treasury and AP professionals say it's increasing. How is it increasing if they're using the same category of attack method? Maybe I'm leading you a little bit there, but what's changing to make their attacks more effective? I guess is probably the more straightforward way to ask it.
No, yeah. You guys had an interesting data point in one of your surveys as well around BEC attacks, really almost doubling over a 2-year period. That's a common form of a fraud attack that I've been seeing for many, many years as have many other Treasury practitioners. So it's almost as if everybody knows they're coming, but you still can't defend yourself against them, right? Those attacks the success from those attacks is still doubling over that period. And I think it comes down to, the attacks are getting a lot more automated, more sophisticated. The fraudsters themselves are using, really great data sources to make these attacks look more real, know who to attack, who that individual would take maybe their direction from to approve a payment. And but I think, one way or the other, if you just sort of to kind of generalize it a bit, it seems like the ways that the attacks are being carried out are advancing more quickly than the protections companies are putting in place to defend against those attacks, right? And so that's a scary trend just generally, and something we obviously look to reverse here.
Some really good points there. Despite we're more aware of it, the criminals are sophisticated and use automated methods. And I was fretting because we had received like 3 system-wide email alerts about phishing and other things. These attacks that are coming through our system, we're getting all these alerts, as well as data loss prevention setups we have where there's concerns about a new employee forwarded an email or a form that they signed that included their tax ID to their home email address. So we get all kinds of alerts about these things. It's just it's amazing how much is going on in and out to to make sure things are protected despite the level of attacks. So that's really good information, John, on the reason for payment security. Really, really helpful context. This idea, we're in football season in the U.S., football meaning American football with the odd-shaped leather ball that takes place. This idea of payment fraud and stacking your defensive line, gives a little bit of a link to the football series of having a defensive line and stacking it with great resources. And you and I have talked about layers in different conversations. This idea of defensive layers, we hear about that in security, and the concept that every layer has to be strong, just like on a football line, I guess. And this concept of stacking a defensive line seems so important. And as we think about it generally, but maybe specifically, can you explain the following, some of this following concept? But let's start with why do layers matter? What's important to them?
Yeah, no, I really like this analogy around stacking your defensive line as almost a framework for fraud mitigation. But I think it really goes back to the point around all the different points of intrusion that organizations are looking to protect these days, both from the department standpoint. So there's, attacks coming into Treasury, AP, procurement, payroll, IT departments. And then within those particular departments, there's particular vulnerabilities that the fraudsters are looking to exploit. People, internal controls, how your system's access is restricted. And, this other point around how fraudsters are now influencing that process so much earlier in the ways that they attack. It's not just at the point of payment initiation anymore. It's, it's further downstream here at the point of AP invoice input, or even, the supplier wire instruction changes or original inputs here. And really without the layers, you only have one chance to really detect those attacks before they become a loss. So if we were to take an example here, maybe these fake vendor instruction change requests are a good one to start with here. But a request comes in to change your wire instructions, and maybe the internal process is to validate that request came from a trusted contact at the supplier. And so you look at who the request came from. Okay, it came from Tom Adams. He's our main contact at XYZ supplier. This is his email address. This all looks legitimate. Let's go ahead and make that update to our vendor master. But what if the supplier's email account was actually hacked, right? What if it was the supplier that was the victim of the fraudulent attack? And so now you have a fraudulent account in your vendor master, and you're going to continue to make payments to that fraudulent account until somebody figures that out, right? Every time an AP invoice drops into AP and a batch runs that goes out to that supplier, it's going to be another fraudulent invoice or another fraudulent payment going out until somebody is able to detect that. Commonly, the way that organizations detect that is that the supplier reaches out and says that they have a bunch of unpaid invoices, and you realize you're paying to the wrong counterparty in that instance. But, if you think about that, the intrusion's happening so far downstream that there's lots of other opportunities to catch those fraudulent payments if you have these other layers of protection in place. So this is really what I think of as, stacking your defenses when it comes to fraud mitigation.
Catch them early on, catch them in the middle, catch them at the end. Yeah, excellent. I think maybe one of the things we can also talk about is, as we look at these defense layers, they can include, banking services, technology solutions like your firm offers, process changes, whether it's supported within an AP system, within a payment hub like TIS, or anywhere that AP or Treasury or anybody's making payments looks at things. And I want to throw one more thing on there to you, John, to make the question as complex as I can with that background I just laid out there. Is, as you think about some of the newer layers, we talked about existing attacks and changes that criminals are making to make these attacks more complex and harder to defend. What are some of the newer layers on the defensive side to combat the newer attack methods that are coming through? I wonder if you could start us off there.
There are some historical layers, your training and awareness creation, your internal process controls, how your user management is restricted, but also, like you mentioned, a lot of newer technologies out there that are able to provide almost a safety net for your fraud mitigation strategies. So these include these more intelligent kind of fraud detection programs that are able to proactively screen your payment activity to detect abnormalities. This can be as simplistic as a screening process to be able to pick out who your safe pay vendors are, the vendors that you're paying all the time, those that are part of your vendor master. It could also be, it could also include third-party validation type tools like a third-party source of confirmed beneficiary bank account details. And then if you take it kind of the next level, you get this intelligent fraud detection type software that's really coming to market now and is really kind of one of the most promising solutions, I think, for most organizations in the fight against fraud. So these are your more rule-based type detection softwares, or even those that use AI and pattern recognition to be able to proactively pick out what those potential suspicious transactions are, bring those to the attention of the right individuals within your organization to have a decision on those before they're released out to the banks. So these are obviously great tools. You talk about stacking your defenses, the layers. This is your final layer here. This is your safety net before anything that squeaks through your internal controls becomes an actual fraud loss.
You laid out a number of the newer layers. Maybe we could touch on a few of those. So you mentioned screening. What does screening look like? Is this the process of I've got a change in a pay bank account information and I receive that via email, now I call based on a number I have? Is that what you mean by screening, or is it something else?
Yeah, so that can be one form of screening, or it can be sort of more organizationally specific. So for example, you can put in place a list of safe pay vendors, right? For example, maybe this marries up to your vendor master. You're confident in the checks you have in place before new vendors are added to that master, and you want to proactively screen against it so that you're catching any payments out to first-time payees, for example, right? These are kind of your common indicators, so to speak, for BEC attacks, maybe even fake invoice attacks if you're paying out to first-time payees. You can also fold in other company-specific requirements like screening based on certain country risk profiles, for example, right? You want to screen all beneficiary payments to a certain country you perceive as risky or that you don't do business in, so to be able to detect transactions that way. So that's one iteration of screening, the way that we see it put in place in a way that's effective for organizations.
So one of the things you said is it sounded like you were talking about I think you referred to it as safe pay list or safe vendor list. And is this assigning some type of score or safety rating based upon how long you've paid them or something else? Is this a scoring method, or how are you going about doing that?
Yeah, so there are a couple different ways that organizations and providers offer this functionality. One is a true safe pay list that organizations might marry up to a list of trusted vendors that have already gone through some other sort of internal vetting process. But there's also screening tools that do exactly what you mentioned before in terms of assigning a risk score to that particular beneficiary based on certain metrics, so to speak, right? So looking at maybe, for example, the frequency of payments to that particular beneficiary, or other metrics that indicate whether or not it's normal or abnormal. The payment amounts, the payment currency would all be good indicators as well that you could fold into that kind of algorithm to calculate that risk score. So we've actually seen it done both ways, and both solutions don't need to be necessarily exclusive of each other. They work well hand in hand as well.
Jon, we talked briefly about screening. Maybe you can layer in some of the tech elements of screening. What are some of the different ways that tech can help with the screening process?
Sure. Yeah, there are quite a few different tools that these types of technologies can use in order to help organizations more proactively detect fraudulent transactions. At the very basic sense, there can be a set of rule-based screening parameters put in place that flag things like first-time payees, for example, right? Or if you're initiating a payment in a different currency than you usually pay a particular supplier. And then, there are other technologies that can be folded into these types of solutions that more proactively detect abnormalities based on your historical payment activity. So these is where your AI-based solutions and your pattern recognition type technologies come into place that can look broadly across your payment set and be able to determine, are you paying this particular beneficiary at a frequency that's abnormal? You usually pay them once a month. This is the third time you paid them in this particular month, or in a much higher amount, obviously, than you typically would. And so these tools all, really kind of go hand in hand together in terms of making a holistic fraud detection solution, both rule-based and pattern recognition, to help organizations get to that really defined screening criteria to pick up on that level of risk that they really want to detect. But at the essence of it, really what these tools are looking for to really feed them is data. So it's data from the standpoint of the organization's historical payment data that can be analyzed for both rule-based and AI pattern recognition purposes. It's third-party data, like we talked about before, that can be used for beneficiary account validations. And even these days, tools are beginning to use broader community data sets to look across a much bigger data set to give organizations even more capabilities for fraud detection.
So this, as you refer to the community, I think that relates to the idea of network options that I mentioned earlier. So this community is the power of a network. What's the power of a network? How big is the network? What can you do with the network? So how can a company leverage the power of the community? Is it just it's a bigger data set that you can validate information on? What?
Yeah, sure. I mean, at a very basic sense, it's about broadening the data set, right? It's about not just looking at your historical payment activity, but looking at that of an entire community, and really leveraging the trends of organizations that are similar to yours to be able to detect abnormalities. Like I mentioned before, detection tools, they thrive on data. And the more data you give them, the more sophisticated you can really get with your detection capabilities. From a community standpoint, fraud doesn't just impact one company. There's a whole community out there that are facing the same threats within your industry and beyond. So it only makes sense for organizations to use all that data to their advantage. One key advantage of it is that the data is always up to date. It's always recent, right? There's always fresh transactions running through there. And it's also continuously growing as more and more transactions are executed. So, kind of naturally, the more data you give a fraud detection tool, the smarter and smarter it's going to get. Even from a provider standpoint, having access to such a broad data set to help protect against threats is a huge asset as well, because we don't know how threats are going to evolve over time, what's really coming next, but we do know that it's going to take data and patterns and at different points here to be able to proactively detect it. So it also helps your tool become really, in a sense, future-proof and able to address fraud threats as they adapt within the market.
Since the criminals get together and share information on how to compromise payment systems and AP processes, it makes sense that the corporations share information to fight against that.
That's exactly it. Yeah, I mean, the fraudsters are attacking with automated tools, data, and sharing information through a community. And so, yeah, it just makes sense for corporates to do the same thing to protect against those threats.
So does this work like if you mentioned about having rules and having basically machine learning or pattern detection? This is something that hasn't happened before. Pattern detection flags it as anomalous. I get that. The other part was you have rules that say, hey, here's a new vendor, be careful about it. One aspect here on if you're looking at this broader community or network, are you the first one? If you're the first one doing it, that's one thing, but it's like, okay, we're doing whatever our check is, but what if nobody else is paying that vendor or to that account? Or, yeah, there's 6 others that have made the payment. Maybe you could talk through the value and how that may work, for adding value of the network power, the community power.
Yeah, so I mean, most companies in certain industry verticals, they're paying all the same suppliers, right? And for the most part, there's a lot of commonality in the payment instructions that are being used. So the community aspect becomes a really powerful tool to be able to validate what's legitimate and what's fraudulent. And so from the standpoint of both, I think, fraud detection, being able to look at a community's historical payment activity to be able to pick up, am I paying a different bank account number than the rest of the community, or at a very abnormal frequency or in much higher amounts? That's powerful. And it also gives you a tool to be able to validate that the supplier is legitimate as well, right? So if there's a lot of payments going out to a particular supplier beneficiary account that you're also using, then that's a good validation that those instructions are actually legitimate. One thing that we talk to a lot of organizations about, and what they're always looking to do when they implement a solution like this, is to minimize the false positives. So it's not just about detection, it's about not picking up more than you really need to in this process, and creating this big administrative burden that you then need to staff with another individual to manage, an endless workflow queue of false positives on a day-to-day basis. So I think that's another, value of the community effect here. The other is that, we talked a lot about how the fraudsters don't just attack one individual, they attack, multiple, and there's value of sharing that data within the community. So, if somebody is attacked and they determine that a particular account's being used in these fraudulent attacks, they can go ahead and proactively alert the community and say, okay, here's an account number that we're seeing being used in fake invoice attacks, for example. It's flagged as fraudulent. Share that information amongst the rest of the community so that if anybody else sees that same attack, even if they do fall victim to it, they wouldn't have a loss as a result of it. So there's a lot of other use cases for community data as well. I think we're just kind of scratching the surface here, but it's definitely a very powerful data set that can be used in a lot of ways that are unique to it.
Jon, as we talked about community data, the power of a network, do you have any other case studies or an example of how the power of a community can have a bigger impact on stopping fraud?
Yeah, I think a really good one is if we go back to that fake wire instruction example that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, where the fake wire instruction change request came in, but it was actually sent through a hacked supplier email account, so it looked legitimate. And so, that's a situation where most organizations might fall prey to that attack. Even if they had a detection tool in place, maybe the payment goes out, right? Goes through the detection tool picks it out as a first time account, but you say, that makes sense. The supplier just recently changed their wire instructions. We have validation from our main relationship person over there that this is a legitimate account. Let's let this go through. But if you layer in the community data aspect of that, you're now looking at, okay, this is the first time we've ever paid this particular beneficiary account. Within our community, there's 50 other community members that are paying this supplier, but none of them are paying this account. They're all paying a different account ending, 6537. Hey, that's the account that we used to have on file here before we made the change a week ago. And it brings that extra level of emphasis to have you kind of like look at that one more time and be able to catch that as a actual fraudulent transaction, right? So I think that's a good example of the power of community kind of in this layered approach of fraud detection.
What happens if three of them, the email was compromised and they alerted all of the vendors or many of the companies that were going to pay their vendors, and three had just made the change? Is there also some way of calibrating that to say these are all recent changes, which could indicate a legitimate change or that, or that a compromise had occurred, across the board?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, bringing in different data points there to help either validate that or confirm that that's a false positive is definitely very helpful as well. So, a change in the beneficiary account in combination with a payment in a different currency or in a much higher amount than usual, those can be used in combination, or those historical changes like you mentioned, right? That all of these changes were relatively recent, and to flag those for additional review, those can be additional kind of metrics that are put into that risk-based scoring to be able to detect that it's a potential fraudulent transaction.
Yeah, that's excellent. There's more data points to look at and measure, right? Whether it's you mentioned change in behavior, currency, patterns, what doesn't look normal, the power of community, seeing how things have shifted. Very, very good points there, Jon.
I mean, it's all about bringing in multiple different data points, I think, to get as precise as you possibly can. Even some of these third-party data validations, right? If you have the opportunity for the tool to also do a validation against a list of confirmed beneficiary accounts, that's another good data point that you could bring in combination with the account change to be able to detect if this is an actual real alert or false positive as well. So yeah, it's all about getting as refined as possible in that screening process through bringing in multiple different data elements and sources.
Now, just to close out the podcast on payment fraud stacking your defensive line, any final thoughts or words of advice, Jon?
Yeah, maybe the one point to make here is that the fraud threats themselves, they're always evolving, right? The fraudsters are always changing it, how they attack organizations, what their preferred method to do that is. And so it's important for organizations to both put in place a good solution for fraud mitigation, but then to always kind of benchmark that against the threats in the market. Look at what your capabilities are, what your controls are, what technology you're using, how you're using it, and really how it specifically addresses the threats in the market, right? That's a lot of what we've tried to do in the development of our product, is not just to put a lot of random checks and things like that into organizations' hands, but understand really how those solve the threats that they're facing. And companies can do the exact same thing on their own to make sure that their fraud mitigation strategies are in alignment with those threats.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jon. Appreciate you joining me on the Treasury Update podcast.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Craig. Happy to be here.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.